them off. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, not really. But tonight, everything felt different. The wind outside howled, and the cold in her room seemed unnatural, like it was coming from inside the walls. She was sitting at her desk, trying to study for her final exams, but the room felt too still, too quiet. She pulled her blanket tighter, thinking it was just the storm. The wind rattled the windows, but that wasn't it. It was the heaviness in the air, the strange sense that something was wrong. Then the light above her flickered, once, twice, then it went out completely. Emily sat frozen, the darkness pressing in around her. Her heart started to race. She turned on her flashlight, the beam shaky as it lit up the room. The cold air wrapped around her, and she felt her breath come out in sharp puffs. Her feet felt heavy as she stood up, her mind racing. She walked toward the window, but the storm outside didn't seem to help. The wind was too loud, too angry. She looked back at the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see the dark hallway beyond. Her stomach turned. She knew she had locked it. Had she imagined it? Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. As her fingers brushed against the handle, she heard it, the whisper. "Emily." It was soft, almost like a breath against her ear. The voice sent a cold chill down her spine. It was so faint she almost thought it was the wind, but it was too clear, too real. Her name, she was sure of it. Emily stepped into the hallway, her body tense. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, maybe some prank by the other students, but she couldn't ignore it. The whispers were growing louder, now coming from all directions. She remembered the rumors, the stories the older students whispered about the East Wing, the abandoned part of the school. They said you could hear voices in the halls, that some students had gone missing there, never to be seen again. But Emily wasn't one to believe in stories, not really. Still, tonight, the whispers were different. They were real. The voice was real. It wasn't a story anymore. It was happening to her. The door to the East Wing was just ahead. It had always been locked, but tonight, it was slightly open, the darkness beyond inviting her in. Emily felt a strange pull, as if the whispers were leading her there. The door creaked when she pushed it open. The air inside was cold, much colder than it should have been, and it smelled stale, like something had been forgotten for years. The flashlight flickered as she stepped inside, and the dark corners seemed to swallow the light. The floor was covered with dust, and the walls were cracked and peeling. The silence was suffocating, but the whispers had stopped. Now there was only the feeling of being watched. She stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the air around her. It was thick, like the room was alive, holding its breath. The faint smell of decay lingered in the back of her throat. Every part of her screamed to turn around and leave, but she couldn't. Something was drawing her deeper into the room. She took a few steps forward, and that's when she saw it. A figure, standing in the corner, almost hidden in the darkness. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as her flashlight flickered back to life, she saw it more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its limbs were too long, stretched in an impossible way. The shadows seemed to cling to it, twisting around its shape. It didn't move at first. It just stood there. Emily's heart skipped. Her breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. She was frozen, caught in place. The figure took one slow step forward. Emily felt it in her chest, a tightening, a pressure. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to scream, But no sound came out. The figure's eyes were dark, empty, like there was nothing behind them. Its mouth was stretched into a twisted grin that didn't belong to any human. The room seemed to darken around her, the shadows pressing in from every corner. Her skin crawled, the air growing heavier, colder. Emily's mind raced. What is it? What's happening? Her thoughts were interrupted as the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It felt like time was stretching, like she was stuck in a nightmare where she couldn't wake up. Her chest tightened as it reached out, its long, bony fingers pointing directly at her. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," it whispered. The voice wasn't just in her ears, it was in her mind. The words echoed in her head, louder and louder, as if the very walls were repeating them. The weight in the room grew unbearable. She couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, and she could feel the air grow colder with each step it took. She could hear her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The shadows twisted around her, pressing in on every side. The door had slammed shut behind her, and she was trapped. No way out. The figure's grin widened. "You should have stayed away." Emily's heart was still pounding as she stared at the figure in front of her. It stood in the middle of the east wing, its hollow eyes boring into her, its crooked grin stretching wider with every second. The cold in the room was unbearable, suffocating. The figure didn't move, but Emily could feel it watching her, waiting for her to do something, anything. She wanted to run, but her legs felt frozen to the floor. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to leave, but her body refused to listen. The whispers that had filled the room earlier were now replaced by a heavy silence. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath. The figure took a slow step forward, and Emily's chest tightened. Her breath came in short gasps. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What was this thing? She had never believed in the stories about the school, about the ghostly figures, the cursed halls. But now, standing face to face with the figure, she couldn't deny what was happening. She could feel its presence in every inch of the room, its shadow pressing against her. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily." The words rang in her ears. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, as if something was choking her from the inside. Her eyes darted to the door, the one she had come through just moments ago. But it was no use. The door was gone. The room had swallowed it whole, trapping her inside. She was alone with the figure, in a place she had no business being. Her heart pounded faster, and she could feel the sweat on the back of her neck. She didn't know how long she had been standing there, frozen, her thoughts racing. The figure was still there, but it hadn't moved closer. Not yet. The tension in the room was unbearable. Why was it waiting? Emily tried to force her legs to move, but they felt as heavy as stone. She looked around frantically, her mind searching for some escape, some way out. But the room was closing in. The walls seemed to get smaller, the shadows thicker, as if the space itself was alive. She was trapped. This is it. This is where it ends. The thought made her stomach turn, and for the first time since she had entered, she wanted to cry. She wanted to break down and scream. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. The figure took another step forward, and Emily gasped. Her body wanted to move, but her feet stayed planted in place. The cold in the room seemed to reach into her bones. The figure's grin grew wider, its black eyes gleaming with malice. Emily felt her pulse race, her body screaming for her to flee, but she still couldn't move. She thought back to the rumors about the East Wing, about the students who had disappeared, about the ghost that haunted this place, the one that never let anyone leave. Her mind flashed to the stories she had heard as a child, how the school was built on the site of an old church, how it had always been cursed. She remembered her parents' warnings when they sent her here, the way they had looked at each other when they talked about Ashmore. Don't believe everything you hear, they had said, but deep down they had known something was wrong. Now she was paying the price for ignoring it. She hadn't believed in ghosts, hadn't thought they could reach her. But here, standing in this cursed place, it was all too real. The figure was only a few feet away now. Emily's eyes were glued to it, her body paralyzed. She could hear its breath, low and raspy, filling the silence in the room. The air felt like it was pressing down on her, thick with the weight of the figure's presence. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as its shadow seemed to grow, covering the walls, closing in around her. She tried to take a step back, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure reached out, its long skeletal hand hovering in the air. Its fingers twitched. It was so close. Emily felt her heart stop. She was trapped, and there was nowhere to run. Then the figure's mouth opened, and a voice, low and growling, slithered into her ears. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," it repeated, its voice like 1,000 whispers all tangled together. "Now you belong to me." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Her chest felt tight, and she couldn't breathe. It was as if the figure's words had wrapped around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. She tried to scream, but the sound was stuck in her throat. The figure's shadow stretched toward her, its hand moving closer. Emily couldn't move, couldn't speak. The cold in the room had turned to ice, freezing her to the spot. She could feel her body shaking, her teeth chattering from the chill. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was getting closer, its fingers reaching out for her. She could feel the weight of its presence pushing against her. The air was so thick with fear she could barely breathe. "You're mine now," the figure said again, its voice laced with cold fury. Emily's mind screamed for a way out, but the room was closing in around her. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees, unable to fight anymore. The figure's hand reached for her face, its icy fingers brushing against her skin. As the cold settled in, Emily felt herself slipping away, as if the shadows themselves were swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the figure's voice, growing louder, deeper as it whispered in her ear. "You should have stayed away." Emily could feel her breath coming faster, each gasp cold and sharp in the thick air of the east wing. The figure was still there, its pale, twisted face staring into hers with empty eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Every part of her wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but her body wouldn't listen. It felt like the air had turned to stone, holding her in place, trapping her with the figure in the darkness. She tried to move her legs, but they were stiff, locked in place by fear. Her heart hammered so loudly in her chest that it felt as if the whole building could hear it. The figure stood motionless, its crooked grin never wavering. It was so quiet now that the only sound was the pounding of Emily's heart in her ears. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, pushing her deeper into panic. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in as if the building itself was alive and trapping her. The figure's eyes were like black holes, pulling her deeper into their emptiness. Emily wanted to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. She could feel her body trembling, the chill of the room crawling under her skin. The air was freezing, and yet sweat was pouring down her back. She looked around, searching for any way out, but there was nothing. The hallway was gone. The door had disappeared when she entered, and now there was only the oppressive darkness and the figure in front of her. How had it gotten so close? She couldn't remember. The figure's slow, jerky movements had been like something out of a nightmare, and now it was standing just inches from her. Its breath was cold against her face, but it didn't smell like anything. Just the sharp, bitter scent of decay. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," it whispered, its voice a deep rasp. The words were like nails on a chalkboard, sending a shiver down her spine. Emily felt her stomach twist. The figure knew her name, knew who she was. She had heard the rumors, but now it wasn't a story. It was real. This thing, this creature, was a part of Ashmore Academy's dark past. She realized now, it had always been here. She had walked into its lair. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners shifted, swirling like they were alive. Emily's mind screamed for her to break free, to escape, but she couldn't move. Her body was frozen, caught in a trap of terror that was tightening with every second. The figure raised its long, bony hand toward her. Emily's pulse quickened. She was trapped. The shadows seemed to stretch with the movement, wrapping around her, and she could feel the cold seeping into her skin, into her bones. Its finger touched her cheek, icy and unfeeling. The moment the figure's hand made contact, Emily felt a jolt, like an electric shock, but it was much worse. It wasn't pain. No, it was deeper. It was wrong. Her vision blurred, and she felt the cold seeping inside her, filling her chest with an empty, suffocating feeling. She gasped, her body trembling uncontrollably as the shadows seemed to squeeze tighter around her. The figure's voice came again, low and cold. "You wanted to know the truth, didn't you?" it hissed. "You wanted to learn the secrets of Ashmore Academy. You wanted to uncover the darkness that has been hiding here for years." The words felt like a punch to her stomach. She remembered the stories now, the stories she had brushed off, the ones about the missing students, the ones about the founder and the cursed East Wing. But this was no curse. She was part of it now. She had stepped into the darkness, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The figure's fingers dug into her skin, icy and hard. It was pulling at her, drawing her in. "This school has always been a prison," it whispered, "a prison for those who can never leave." Emily's heart pounded harder, her chest tight with panic. She wanted to fight back, to push the figure away, but she couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight. She was sinking into the darkness, into the cold, into the curse of the school that had been waiting for her. The whispers around her grew louder, like voices from the past, trapped in the walls of Ashmore Academy. "You're not the first to step inside," the figure continued, "and you won't be the last. The school will take you, just like it has taken the others." The words echoed in her head, filling every corner of her mind. Emily struggled to breathe, feeling the weight of her fear crushing her chest. She tried to fight, but her body felt numb. The figure's grip on her tightened, and she felt herself being pulled toward it, into the shadows. The room was spinning now, the whispers growing louder, the darkness closing in on her. Emily could feel the figure's cold breath on her face as it whispered in her ear, "You're mine now, Emily. Forever." The air seemed to freeze, the room becoming so cold that she could barely feel her fingers or toes. The darkness was suffocating, and her body felt heavy. She was slipping away, losing herself to the cold and the shadows. The figure smiled again, its eyes gleaming with darkness. "You'll never leave this place," it whispered, its voice fading into the endless black. Emily's mind was spinning. The world around her was shifting, and she couldn't tell where reality ended and nightmare began. The figure's grip was ice cold on her arms, its fingers digging deep into her flesh, its touch like fire and ice all at once. The whispers had returned, louder now, deafening, filling the space around her. The walls of the east wing seemed to pulse with life, their dark shadows stretching and reaching toward her. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the faint scent of wet earth, as if the very walls were alive with something old and hungry. It was everywhere. The room was closing in, squeezing tighter and tighter, suffocating her in its grip. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her chest felt as if it was being crushed by the weight of the darkness. The cold seeped deeper into her skin, her bones, as though the figure was pulling her soul out of her body. She wanted to scream, but her throat was so tight, her voice stuck. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. The figure's grip on her arm was unyielding, its fingers curling like claws, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Its eyes locked onto hers, black and empty, with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "You're nothing," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 whispers, layered together, all chanting her name. "You are part of this place now, Emily. Part of the darkness that has been here for so long." The words felt like ice running through her veins. They were cold, unfeeling, and they twisted deep inside her, choking off every last bit of hope she had left. Emily struggled, her mind racing. How could this be happening? The stories, the rumors, everything she had brushed off, every warning she ignored, had all led her here, to this moment. She was trapped. This place, this school, was more than just haunted. It was alive, and it had always been alive. The figure moved closer, its breath like frost on her face. It grinned again, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, showing teeth too sharp, too many. The shadows that had been creeping along the walls now surrounded her, reaching out like tendrils, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down. She felt her body weakening, her strength draining away. The figure leaned in close, its cold breath washing over her face. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily," it hissed, its voice deepening, becoming more monstrous. "But now you are part of it, forever." Emily's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but there was none. The shadows were everywhere. The whispers were suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was as if the very air was alive, pressing against her chest, pushing her down into the darkness. Every part of her wanted to run, to fight, to escape, but there was nowhere to go, no way out. Her heart thundered in her chest, but the room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in tighter with each passing second. Her hands shook as she reached out for anything that might give her a way to break free. But the shadows tightened around her, and the figure's grip held her in place. "You are nothing," it repeated. "You're just a piece of the curse, just like the others. They're all here, Emily. You'll never escape." The room felt like it was spinning. Emily's mind screamed for a way out, but the terror consumed her. Her body was heavy, sluggish, as if the darkness was seeping into her bones, filling her with coldness. The whispers became clearer, and she realized with a sickening twist in her stomach that they weren't just whispers. They were the voices of the missing students. They were trapped here, just like her. "We never left," a voice said, its tone familiar. "We're all still here." Emily froze. Her blood ran cold as the room seemed to twist, the walls contorting and shifting. The shadows thickened and the voices grew louder. "We are part of Ashmore," another voice whispered, and Emily could feel it inside her, deep inside her mind. "And now, you are too." She couldn't move, couldn't escape. The shadows swirled around her, suffocating her in their cold embrace. Her chest tightened as she felt herself sinking deeper, into the darkness, into the school that would never let her go. "Welcome to your new home, Emily," the figure said, its voice cold and final. "You're one of us now, forever." The words echoed in her head, filling her thoughts. The room around her was no longer just a room. It was a part of her, a part of the curse that had bound her here. She was no longer Emily. She was part of Ashmore, and she would never leave. The figure stepped back, its shadow disappearing into the darkness. The whispers faded, but the presence lingered, suffocating her, wrapping around her like a cocoon. She was trapped in the school, trapped in the curse that had been waiting for her. Her body felt cold, numb, as the darkness consumed her, pulling her deeper into the void. And as she faded into the shadows, the last thing she heard was the figure's voice, one last whisper in her ear. "You'll never leave."